The original Penn station was built in 1910. It was sold and demolished in 1962 to make room for a larger rail station and Madison Square Garden. Now, the story of Penn Station is a really tragic one that I think a lot of people don't really understand how monumental this building was and how much it was beloved by New Yorkers. The architects for Penn Stations were McKim, Med and White. We have already mentioned these names before with the Savoy Plaza Hotel. And here's a quote given by a New York Times editorial, October 30th, 1963. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. Even when we had Penn Station, we couldn't afford to keep it clean. We want and deserve tin can architecture in a tin horn culture. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. Now, it's just a truly work of art, this building. Just look at the inside of the center of the building. Just look at those pillars and this geometric ceiling and the sheer size. Imagine visiting New York City for the first time, taking a train, leaving the station to see this glorious, welcoming, this is what it was replaced by. Madison Square Garden. As we have already covered in one of the previous buildings. Demolition of Penn Station. In 1963, one of New York City's finest buildings was demolished to make way for a new 116 million sports arena and entertainment complex. Sound familiar? Pennsylvania Station, the monumental 1910 bourgeois masterpiece of architects McKim, Med and White, was leveled and replaced with the fourth incarnation of Madison Square Garden. Now on this website, it is jam-packed with a ton of information on Penn Station, and it just goes to show the significance of the impact of this building and its demolition. And controversy. Now alerted, New York's architects, artists, and writers were outraged at the prospective demise of such a significant structure. Art and architecture institutes almost uniformly called for Penn Station to be preserved. Many were angered that Penn Station was being taken down to make way for commercial development. New Yorkers will lose one of their finest buildings, one of the few remaining from the golden age at the turn of the century, for one reason and one reason only: that a comparatively small group of men wants to make money, wrote the news editor of Progressive Architecture on September 17, 1962. And I couldn't agree less. And it's not just art and architecture, it's many other things too. A small group of men controlling the flow of everything, okay? Controlling the world for their own selfish needs. One architect complained that designers beholden to commercial interests threatened the integrity of his profession and offered a suggestion to avoid disputes among architects. Frequently, when we are fighting an avaricious interest, we also have to fight with our own colleagues who conspire with the predators for a fast buck. Perhaps we should have an oath of the type doctors take, which would make it at least hazardous for an architect to conspire against a cultural domain. Several others advocated relocating the new Madison Square Garden complex to another underutilized site in Manhattan, perhaps the one of the city's urban renewal areas. In a New York Times ad put by the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York states, "It may be too late to save Penn Station. It is not too late to save New York. Serve notice upon present and would-be vandals that will fight them every step of the way." As we know now, unfortunately, the battle to save Penn Station wasn't won.
Until the first blows fell, no one was really convinced that Penn Station would really be demolished, or that New York would permit this monumental act of vandalism against one of the largest and finest landmarks of its age. Any city gets what it admires and will pay for, and ultimately deserves. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but the monuments we destroy. Ada Louise Huxtable.
One of the worst things that's happened in New York's history is the loss of Penn Station. Penn was so traumatic because this was something that belonged to everybody and that people felt was so beautiful and that they were so proud of, that they just took it for granted and felt that it couldn't possibly be torn down. Could you tear down the Grand Canyon? And then it was, and they put this really disgusting rabbit warren in its place.
How tragic, how sad that so many Americans will never know what it was like to arrive in New York for the first time in your life at Penn Station. It was spectacular. If you had never been to New York before and you came into the city for the first time and you came out and there you were in this breathtaking, man-made, wondrous architectural place. Vincent Scully says that we used to come in to New York like gods when we came into Penn Station. Now we come in to the present Penn Station like rats. It was one of the worst things to happen to an American treasure, not just in New York, but in the whole country.
Pennsylvania Station, the greatest architectural monument of the imperial age of rail.
had stood for more than half a century at the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street in New York. When, in the spring of 1961, the financially troubled Pennsylvania Railroad announced plans to tear the magnificent structure down and replace it with a high-rise glass and steel office tower and sports facility, hoping it would bring in more money. Though some voices were raised in protest, the coalition of architects, writers, and historians who tried to stop the demolition could do nothing to save Penn Station from the Wrecker's Ball. And 2 years later, on the morning of October 28, 1963, the demolition began. It would take more than 3 years in all to pull the great stone structure down. One by one, the enormous Doric columns, winged eagles, and granite angels that had ornamented its facade were cut down, carted away, and dumped in a foul-smelling swamp in the New Jersey Meadowlands.
It is inconceivable that Penn Station was destroyed, demolished for one of the sorriest replacements that one could ever imagine. Everything about the ambition of Penn Station and of the great railroad stations expresses the kind of power that had been concentrated in New York. The loss of it was a sad commentary on the ideology of modernism, the belief that new is better, the belief that modern efficiency or that the profiting from new construction is an adequate replacement for the traditions, the heritage, and the real meaning of places in people's lives.
The loss of Penn Station seemed to many an irrefutable confirmation that the age of rail had come to an end, and that the age of the automobile had triumphed. And in many ways, it had. But more than most people understood at the time, the destruction of Penn Station had marked a crucial turning point in the life of New York City.
It's when that comes down that a sense of sacrilege really activates people. It's destroying the past. It is symbolic of the triumph of the auto era over the old interconnected mass transit operations.
It generated, for many people, a different attitude about the new. You know, maybe the tradition of the new, wasn't something that we should celebrate so uncritically.
I think what was gained was even more important than what was lost, and what was lost was, of course, one of the last really magnificent Beaux-Arts constructions in terms of design and space and material and architectural quality. That was lost. What was gained was an enormous groundswell, popular groundswell for preservation, that not everything was expendable, and that some things were worth a struggle, that you had to find uses, you had to find ways to keep the character and the quality and the continuity of a city. It went far beyond actually losing a station. It really was a sense of what is the city and how do you have that resonance really that you get from the past that makes the city rich and real and a rewarding place to be, that it isn't sterile, it isn't the product of building by the bottom line, which of course so much construction is.
Nobody seems to care about New York, except for those of us who live and work here. And we, who do care, believe the time has come to put a stop to the wanton destruction of our greatest buildings, to put a stop to wholesale vandalism. It may be too late to save Penn Station, but it is not too late to save New York. Jane Jacobs and the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York.
We're standing in Pennsylvania Station in the heart of Manhattan, underneath Madison Square Garden.
Penn Station takes up an entire city block from 31st to 33rd Street, from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue. So when it opened in 1910, you could enter the building from each of the streets, but the majority of people would have entered from 7th Avenue, and they would have proceeded down a grand hallway which would have intersected mid-block by a towering hall that looked quite close to the baths of Caracalla from ancient Rome.
This is a moment at the tail end of the Beaux-Arts style. That is the style that is informed by classicism by way of the Renaissance and the Baroque. When you walked past the towering waiting room and moved towards the train tracks, you would enter into this large glass and iron atrium, this train shed very much in the style of the great 19th century European train stations.
The key issue for most people was the grandeur, the scale of these spaces. You have to keep in mind that before the Second World War, this was the primary way that Americans traveled from one place to another. But beginning in the 1950s, Americans began to travel by air, they began to benefit from the interstate highway system, and consequently, the railroads were selling less seats.
The Pennsylvania Railroad realized that one of its great assets was real estate in the center of Manhattan.
The space above the tracks.
And so the railroad decided to demolish Penn Station, maintaining the tracks below ground, building a new Penn Station underneath office towers and Madison Square Garden.
Most people felt that this would keep the railroads alive, but what was overlooked is that there would be the loss of an unforgettable building.
And there were protests. Architects, preservation-minded citizens asked that the railroad reconsider and preserve the building.
But it was too late. So many steps had been taken and the debt was so great that it was impossible to reverse it.
And so the building was demolished.
It took 2 years to demolish the building.
And it was replaced with a building that New Yorkers now love to hate.
It is a building that is underground, it is dark, it is windowless. It still does the job, it is still the busiest train station in the United States, but it is not a building that you would bring anyone to see.